This is the South African journey, a path, unapologetic, raw, and necessary.
Welcome to the South African Journey audiobook series. We're glad to have you with us.
So if you look at the history of South Africa, it's a very complex and interesting one.
The Serpent in the Republic. The fall of Christian South Africa to Marxist deception. Soul sickness, the hidden plague that has eaten South Africa. Since the year 1994, there is a sickness in South Africa. A sickness deeper than corruption, more devastating than misrule, more poisonous than crime. It is soul sickness, the corrosion of the inner life of a people, the disfiguring of the spiritual and moral foundations of a nation. And while it has worn many disguises, liberation, democracy, freedom, its truest face is deception, betrayal, and decay. Let us speak plainly. What began in 1994 was not a democracy. It was a smokescreen, a distortion of life, a masterstroke of illusion and deception. South Africa did not walk into the breeze, but into the whirlwind. It was herded into the dark ages. The term democracy was invoked to usher in what was, in effect, a new era of elite rule, cadre deployment, wholesale looting, and institutional sabotage. And the ruling party, the ANC, made no secret of its priorities. Repeated in Parliament and declared in public, the ANC comes first. South Africa comes second. These were not slips of the tongue. They were policy, they were creed, and they were prophecy. What has followed has been 30 years of devastation economically, culturally, socially, and spiritually. Today, South Africa limps through its streets, her bones hollowed out, her children robbed of wonder, her elders robbed of peace. A raw, festering wound. But how did we get here? To understand the depth of this sickness, we must return to the soul. The true soul of South Africa, the soul that long predated the ANC's communist contamination. When the ANC was founded in 1912, it was born not as a revolutionary Marxist force, but as an African Christian liberation movement. It was conceived in a Methodist church. Its founders were not trained in Moscow or Peking, but in mission schools and theological institutions. They were men of the cloth and conscience. John Dube, Walter Rubusana, Sol Plaatje, Sefako Makatho, Pixley Kassim, Dr. A.B. Zuma, Dr. Moroka, Johannes Mfalela. These were leaders who believed in justice not by bullet, but by principle, grounded in scripture, community, and service. They did not merely oppose injustice. They offered a vision for justice rooted in African Christian values. When Sefako Makatho took the ANC to the traditional leadership chiefs and kings, already Christianized through decades of missionary work, there was no contradiction. The union of spiritual, cultural, and political leadership was natural, powerful, and authentic. A Christian conscience clothed in African identity. But that soul holy, ethical, and rooted was to be bruised. And that bruise, like all dangerous ones, appeared harmless at first like a cancerous lesion. It changed hues slowly, silently reddish purple to brown. And just as a cancer hides in the flesh before consuming the body, a spiritual cancer was seated inside the ANC around the 1940s. That cancer was Marxist-Leninist communism, a godless materialist ideology that recognized no higher power than the party, no moral law except revolution, no justice but revenge. It was in this moment the betrayal began. It was here that the snake slithered in, not through the door, but through the bloodstream. The ANC's soul, once aflame with Christian hope, began to rot quietly from within. The rise of Nelson Mandela must be placed in this context, not as the father of democracy, but as the midwife of distortion. Mandela did not continue the Christian tradition of John Dube and Safeka Maka, Walauda Rabasana, Sol Plaatje. He abandoned it. He replaced it with armed struggle, ideological violence, and a new loyalty to Moscow, not to Christ, to the Communist Manifesto, not to the Beatitudes. Even Mandela admitted, in his own edited-out words, that when he left Evelyn, his devout Christian wife, he entered a path of immorality. But that path was more than personal, it was civilizational. The ANC was never the same again. And soon, neither would South Africa be. 1994 was not the beginning of freedom. It was the completion of the distortion. The ANC that came to power was no longer the ANC of 1912. It had been infected, hijacked, and morphed into a political cartel hiding behind freedom slogans. What emerged was a two-faced monster, one side smiling for global media, the other side plundering the state with surgical precision. What was promised as a new dawn became a long, unbroken night. Under this false democracy, hospitals died, railways rusted, Eskom collapsed. Crime exploded, families disintegrated, hope vanished, but most devastating of all, the soul of South Africa fell sick. Soul sickness is the distortion of life's essence. It is when the spirit of a nation becomes confused, lost, infected. And this soul sickness is not metaphoric. It is everywhere. In the faces of hungry children, in the broken voice of an elder betrayed, in the laughter that has grown sarcastic, bitter, and hollow, in churches now empty or politicized, in the slogans. A revolution shouted by millionaires who drink wine while the people eat sorrow. This soul sickness has metastasized. It is now cultural, generational, moral, and unless it is named, uprooted, and cured, South Africa will continue to drift leaderless, anchorless, and numb. Where to from here? We must begin by naming the lie. This is not democracy. It is deceptocracy. Rule of liars who promise liberation while delivering decay. The ANC must not be romanticized. It must be seen in full light. As a movement that began sacred and ended in sabotage, we must restore memory, restore truth, restore soul. And that starts by declaring what most South Africans already whisper, greater than we were betrayed. Our hopes were. Used as bait, our nation was sold to corruption. And the ones who claimed to fight for our freedom ended up stealing it. And so, we write this not as a history, not even as a critique, but as a funeral dirge for a sickened soul. And as a battle cry for resurrection, let this be said for the record of time. The ANC of 1912 was a sacred Christian project. The ANC of 1994 was a communist counterfeit. The South Africa of today is a casualty of soul, betrayal. And unless we return to truth, to God, to values, and to moral leadership, this sickness will only deepen. And the death of the soul is always the death of a nation. Part 2. The lie of necessary communism. The great lie that props up the post-1994 deception is this, that communism was necessary to destroy apartheid. It is the lie shouted from podiums by millionaire revolutionaries. It is the lie printed in school textbooks edited by ideologues. It is the lie whispered in academic corridors by those who have never touched the streets of struggle. But it is a lie, nonetheless. Let us be clear. Apartheid was evil in its conception and unjust in its exclusion. But it was not static. It was not permanent. It was not immune to pressure. It was already evolving, already in retreat, already being reformed from within and dismantled by the very architects who had built it not out of fear, but for moral reckoning, political calculation, and global accountability. To pretend otherwise is not just historically ignorant. It is politically dishonest. Apartheid was dying, not from bullets, but from conscience and reform. By the 1980s, this apartheid government had already begun its terminal descent. Mixed race. Marriages were legalized. Universities were gradually desegregated. Black, Trade unions were formally recognized. The tricameral parliament was established, a failed step, but a clear sign of change. Talks between the government and ANC had already started in secret. International pressure was mounting, but even more critical, internal Christian moral pressure was breaking the system's spine. And this is what the ANC and its defenders do not want you to remember. It was not communists who softened apartheid's heart. It was the Christian, conscience white, and black that steadily exposed the sin of apartheid in pulpits, universities, and boardrooms. It was the ordinary South Africans, Afrikaners, included, who began to ask themselves, is this who we are? Is this how we want to be remembered? The truth is that many of apartheid's own leaders were already building the bridge out. P.W. Botha, for all his stubbornness, initiated reforms. F.W. de Klerk took the ultimate step. This is not to praise apartheid men. It is to recognize historical reality. Apartheid was being unwound by its own engineers. That is not something a communist will ever admit. Why? Because it destroys their central myth that they were the saviors. That blood was the only answer. That only Marx and Mao could kill the beast, but they were not saviors. They were opportunists. They saw a dying system and ran toward it not to save the people, but to hijack the moment. And once the reins of power were handed over, they did not build a new nation. They plundered it. They divided it. They infected it with the disease of racial revenge, cadre deployment, and institutional theft. They inherited a country on the verge of reconciliation and instead declared war on its soul. The ANC did not liberate South Africa. It captured it. Let this be said loud and clear. South Africa was not liberated by bombs and shopping malls. South Africa was not saved by Soviet manifestos. South Africa was not healed by angry chants and necklace in flames. South Africa was moving toward justice through reform, dialogue, and Christian engagement. The original ANC leaders, those Christian African gentlemen, understood this. They engaged the apartheid government with integrity, spiritual courage, and hope for peaceful integration. But the communists spat on that legacy. They saw faith as weakness. They saw peace as delay. They saw forgiveness as foolishness. And so they erased the Christian ANC of 1912 and rebranded it as a violent Marxist insurrection movement, robbing future generations of the chance to witness a true African path to justice. They replaced Bibles with communist mystosis, called the Freedom Charter. They replaced prayer with propaganda. They replaced conscience with class warfare. And the result? A broken country, a looted economy, a destroyed family structure, a society addicted to racial hatred and entitlement, a generation trained to blame and beg instead of build. The final irony. Here is the final irony. The communists who claimed to defeat apartheid by force were handed the keys by reformers who were already dismantling the house. Brick by brick, the ANC did not storm the gates. They were invited to the table. And what did they do when they sat down? They lit the house on fire. In summary, apartheid was unjust, but it was reforming. Communism was not the cure. It was a deeper disease. The ANC of 1912 was righteous. The ANC of 1994 was infected. South Africa was stolen not by colonizers, but by internal traders who used the name of liberation to justify pillage. The myth that we needed communism to crush apartheid is the grand lie of the post-liberation state. We did not need communism. We needed Christian courage. We needed spiritual unity. We needed the original ANC, the soul that was rooted in justice, humility, and moral clarity. Let this truth be shouted from the rooftops. Communism did not save South Africa. It destroyed it, and the NC betrayed both history and hope. So let it be known, the original ANC was a Christian movement. South Africa was already walking toward peaceful reconciliation. Christian African leaders, traditional chiefs, and even reformist Afrikaners were already circling the same spiritual fire. The nation was already healing slowly. Humbly, wisely, and what destroyed that sacred moment was not apartheid. It was the communist counterfeit. Parasitic ideology that crawled in, feasted on hope, and left a carcass of slogans, race hatred, and endless decay. South Africa's soul sickness did not come from apartheid's ashes. It came from Marxism's poison. And now, if there is to be any future, it must begin with restoring the soul through values that once unified kings, clerics, politicians, and people. We were always meant to meet at that sacred point of shared faith, shared ethics, and shared dignity. That road was already built, but we turned away. Let us return, not with weapons, not with ideologies, not with vengeance, but with truth, with memory, with the courage to say, we had a path, and we left it. Now we must find it again. The Christian sun that rose over South Africa in 1912 was not a weak light dot. It was the only true dawn we ever had. And it is